Good morning. We haven't done as many videos, but we haven't had really as many videos that we could do. So I thought today, since you don't have this book, you have links to it. So if you end up wanting to just read it yourself, you can. But I thought I would read it out loud, and it's from A Little History of Literature, and it's on utopias and dystopias. And my kids have mixed opinions on them. I have some kids that enjoyed reading dystopias, and then I had some kids that did not. We actually did read the book Utopia, which was interesting because, there's stories about different kinds of utopias, but in the end, none of them really worked. And we know as Christians that the only utopia we'll ever have is heaven. And so I thought I'd read this, though. It's called Brave New Worlds, Utopias and Dystopias. And so since there's a lot of that genre, even from the late 1700s, early 1800s, Jonathan Swift writes about utopias. The guy that wrote Utopia wrote about utopias. All of a sudden, I can't remember his name. But anyway, it'll kind of give us an idea about why they were written and how to read them. Because you are going to encounter those kinds of literature in high school as you're reading, and in college, and just in books in general. So, okay, let's begin. Utopia is an ancient Greek word meaning literally good place. If you had used it in conversation with, say, Sophocles or Homer, however, they might well have looked at you oddly. The word was invented by an Englishman, Sir Thomas More, in the 16th century as the title of a story that pictured a world in which everything was perfect. The fact that More had his head chopped off a few years later by questioning Henry VIII's marriage arrangements suggests that the England he was living in was something less than perfect. Literature has the godlike ability, simply using the faculty of the imagination to create whole worlds. It's helpful to think of putting those worlds on a line, with realism on one end and fantasy on the other end. The closer a literary world is to the author's world, whatever time the author's writing in, the more realistic the work of literature is. Pride and Prejudice depicts a world which, it's safe to presume, was very like the one in which Jane Austen lived and wrote. Conan the Barbarian envisages a world that is entirely different from the seedy 1930s Texas backwater, where the author, Robert E. Howard, fantasized his superhero, and the Chimeria, where Conan performs his superheroics. Utopias tend, like Conan, to cluster at the fantasy end of the line for a very good reason, that there has never yet been a perfect society or anything approaching one. Some writers think we are progressing, however, gradually towards that perfection. The utopias are prophetic. A good example is H.G. Wells' The Shape of Things to Come in 1933. Wells believed that the extraordinary leaps forward in technology that the late 19th and early 20th century saw would bring about technotopia. A lot of science fiction has been written on that theme, and I'm sure you can think of a couple of others. Others think we are moving away from realizing a better world than the one in which we now live. In the 19th century, there was a yearning for a romanticized medievalism which has been lost to urbanization and the Industrial Revolution. These back-to-simplicity utopias are nostalgic. One of the most famous and influential was William Morris's socialistic fable, A Dream of John Ball, 1888, in which he celebrates the organic nature of medieval society, something destroyed by urbanization and industrialization. Whether looking forwards or backwards, all societies have a grand vision of what is, was, or will be their good place. In ancient Greece, Plato's Republic imagined a perfect city in which everything would be rationally arranged, with philosopher kings, like Plato himself, in charge. In societies where Christianity is dominant, images of biblical Eden in the past and heaven in the future tend to inspire and color literature's utopian visions. In ancient Rome, it was Elysium, that is, the Elysian fields, a perfect natural world. In Muslim societies, paradise. For the Vikings, it was Valhalla, a home of great heroes celebrating their feats in battle. Communism believed, following Marx, that there would come in the distant future what he called the withering away of the state, and a condition of perfect social equality among men. These belief systems have all, in their different ways, inspired authors to create imaginary worlds. Humanity's happy ending. But the big problem with literary utopias, and Moore's is no exception, is that they tend to be yawn-inducingly dull. Literature is most readable when it adopts a critical, skeptical, or downright quarrelsome position. What is called the dystopian view of things makes for livelier reading and more provocative thinking about past, present, and future societies. The point can be made by looking at some of the more famous literary dystopias, which, if you haven't read them yet, are certainly worth seeking out. Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451 has a teasing title. I think, Nathaniel, you possibly read it. Abigail read it the beginning of this term, maybe. It's the temperature at which printed paper spontaneously bursts into flame, a metaphor you might think for literature itself. Bradbury wrote it in 1953. He was inspired to do so by the arrival of television as a mass medium. As Bradbury saw it, TV's rise was the death of the book. Bradbury thought this was a very bad thing. Books, he believed, made people think. They were stimulating. The television set did the opposite. It was a narcotic, and sinisterly, television made possible a power over the population that no dictator had previously enjoyed. A soft tyranny, universal mind control. The hero of Universal 451 is a fireman whose job is not to put out fires, but to burn any surviving books. Bradbury was clearly inspired by the Nazi book burnings of the 1930s. While at work, the hero casually picks up a book from a bonfire he had been sent out to start and becomes thereafter a reader and a rebel. He ends a refugee in the woods where a like-minded community memorize great works of literature and become themselves living books. Their flame will burn on, perhaps. What is fascinating about Fahrenheit 451 is that, like other great dystopian literature, it is both right and wrong. Bradbury's pessimism about TV is plainly wrong-headed. TV has enriched, not impoverished culture. Bradbury's dystopian alarm is one of many illustrations of the mixed feelings that society always has about new technologies. The computer, for example, has revolutionized contemporary life. I'm reading this from a computer. For the better, most of us would say. But in dystopian fantasy films like The Terminator, the computer Skynet is visualized as mankind's mortal enemy. Cavemen doubtless felt the same about fire. Good servant, bad servant, as the proverb puts it. But Bradbury is 100% right in his analysis of how the most effective modern tyranny works. It doesn't have to chop off heads with a guillotine or purge whole classes of people as did Stalin and Hitler. It can work just as well by thought control. The title of this chapter, Brave New Worlds, echoes Miranda's exclamation when she sees Ferdinand and his new companions in Shakespeare's The Tempest. Miranda has been brought up on an island where the only other human being is her aged father. When she sees handsome young men of noble character like Ferdinand, she jumps to the conclusion that in the outside world everyone is handsome, young, and noble. If only. Aldous Huxley took Miranda's Brave New World as the title of his dystopia, which, although published in 1932, remains much read today. The narrative is set 2,000 years hence. According to the calendar of that time, it is AF 632. AF stands for after Ford and simultaneously after Freud. What if human beings could be mass-produced in the same way that Henry Ford mass-produced his Model T automobiles, by assembly line? The psychiatrist Sigmund Freud argued that most human neurosis originated in emotional conflicts in the family. What if the nuclear family could be replaced? Huxley came up with the idea of exogenesis, babies in bottles produced in hatcheries or factories like Model T cars, needing no parent other than a team of white-coated laboratory technicians. The result is a perfectly stable society, every member belonging to their assigned upper or lower class, and the whole population kept artificially happy with a mass-distributed tranquilizer, soma. There are no politics, no war, no religion, no disease, no hunger, no poverty, no unemployment. Huxley, remember, was writing in the Great Depression of the 1930s. And above all, no books or literature. Brave New World creates the vision of a utopia, but not one that most of us would want to live in, comfortable as it is. Enter John Savage. The name recalls Rousseau's noble savage, who has been brought up on an American Indian reservation with only a copy of Shakespeare's plays to read. This new world is not for him. He rebels and is destroyed. The brave new world goes on as happily as before. It does not need noble savages or Shakespeare. As with Bradbury, Huxley is both right and wrong in his predictions. There's no likelihood, if one looks at human history, that brave new world, stable world state could ever happen. It's way off the fantasy end of the scale. But Huxley's forecast that biological intervention could transform society in worrying ways is amazingly prophetic. The Human Genome Map, IFV, it means literally fertilizing in glass, and other new biotechnologies makes the babies in bottles scenario entirely plausible. It is not quite within human reach to make humans, as Huxley predicted humans one day would. What brave new world will humankind make with that power? The most argued over dystopia of the last 50 years is Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. Would not recommend reading it. It was published in 1985 when Ronald Reagan was President of the United States. He was in power, some thought, because of the crucial support from the religious right, Christian fundamentalists. That is the starting point for Atwood's feminist, futuristic dystopia. The Handmaid's Tale is set in a post-nuclear war, late 20th century. Fundamentalist Christians have taken over the United States, which they have renamed the Republic of Gilead. African Americans, children of Ham, have been disposed of. Women are again in their subordinate place. At the same time, male and female fertility has declined disastrously. A few women who can bear children are designated handmaids or breeders at the disposal of men. Gilead handmaids have no rights, no social life, and are given the chattel name of their owner. The heroine is Offred, property of Fred. She was captured with her husband and child trying to escape to liberal Canada, a small chauvinism. Atwood is Canadian. Offred is allocated to a powerful male called the Commander. The novel ends with Offred seeming to make her escape from captivity, although it is written so we cannot be entirely sure that she will succeed. It's easy to poo-poo Atwood's grim prophecy. From 2009, there has been a son of Ham in the White House, and you would be brave or stupid to dare to call Michelle Obama or Hillary Clinton, come to that, her husband's handmaid. Excuse me. But parts of Atwood's dystopia ring very true. The recurrent attempts of religious pressure groups in America to control the reproductive rights of women, for instance. So I'm going to say right now that this is written from a liberal point of view. So don't discredit all of it just because they say a couple of things that you don't agree with. Religious groups aren't trying to control the reproductive rights of children. I know that, and you know that. But the information about dystopias and what they represent and how we read them is good. And so we want to take what is good from this and go on. The most influential dystopia of our time has been George Orwell's 1984. So influential, in fact, it has added at least one new word to our language, Orwellian. The novel was conceived in 1948, and some would say is as much about that period as the then distant year of the title. Britain had emerged from the Second World War exhausted and impoverished. No end was in sight. It would be austerity forever. So we're going to pick that up next week, more about Orwell and dystopia. There's not much more to read on that, but then we're going to read a little bit about literature in your lifetime and beyond also for chapter 40. So there's some things for us to think about. Let me know your thoughts on utopias and dystopias. Again, just because they talk about things like religious right and what they assume as the author's point of view to be about that doesn't necessarily take away from the truth about what utopias and dystopias are and how they represent the culture around them and fears. So think of a book maybe that you have read and apply some of that and some of what we've just read to the book that you read, and let me know your thoughts.